It's a pretty common opinion among players that these days, Star Wars The Old Republic has gradually become easier and easier over the years. From leveling, story content, flashpoints, and even many operations, people feel like the challenge has been seriously dialed down. Is this a good thing? A bad thing? Let's talk about it. Back when the game first launched, it played quite differently compared to how it does today in the modern era. It definitely wasn't what you would call an easy game, at least not by MMO standards. Leveling up used to take way longer, and earning your way through even a chunk of the experience bar felt like a genuine accomplishment. Heroic mobs, elites, and champions would absolutely wipe the floor with you if you weren't careful. Anyone who wandered into those heroic areas alone on Drummond cars back in the day was pretty much signing up for a quick death. Class story bosses were often quite challenging and sometimes demanded the help of a friend if you weren't particularly amazing at your own class. Stims and medpacks were practically mandatory for the leveling experience back then, otherwise you'd often find yourself struggling to keep up or outright just getting wrecked. The game genuinely felt difficult in places where it mattered. Even the older flashpoints like False Emperor or Lost Island could wipe an entire group of properly balanced players, tank, healer, DPS, if mechanics weren't followed or if someone failed to pull their weight. The sweet embrace of death was always waiting for any player who let their guard down. The stakes were real. You see, flashpoints used to require a full group of players in specific roles. 2 damage dealers, 1 healer, and 1 tank, the classic setup. But years ago, this was changed in favour of allowing any group composition to enter and complete the flashpoint. Healing stations were placed near boss fights to compensate for missing healers in the queue. Boss mechanics and damage output were also seemingly nerfed to give players an easier time completing the flashpoint, given the group composition changes. The shift actually started with a flashpoint known as Kuat Drive Yards, the first ever tactical flashpoint in the game. It was essentially the beta test for these changes that would eventually roll out to all the other flashpoints as well. If we fast forward to the current era of the game, those flashpoints that once demanded serious skill and coordination can now be soloed by even an average casual player. Lost Island, totally soloable, and that used to be one of the toughest flashpoints around. The False Emperor, same story, and many others follow suit. 13 years ago or more, if you soloed those flashpoints, you were seen as a king, a god among players with exceptional skill and laser focus. But now, your average Kaizaiken could stroll in and knock them out without much trouble. Of course, a lot of these changes were made to make the game more accessible to new players and rookies, which is a fair point, but was the cost worth it? It was clear back then that players wanted the ability to solo flashpoints. Eventually, this was catered to with the introduction of a solo mode, a new option given when tackling a newly released flashpoint for the first time. I believe this was around the Shadow of Revan era or just after, and the flashpoint would also provide you with your own personal GSI combat droid, which everybody referred to as the Jesus bot, seeing as it could basically take down anything for you. This new system gave players the ability to see the story of a flashpoint without the interference of other players, allowing them to progress their own main character story arcs at their own pace. So if the game is easier now, how did this happen, and why? I've already laid out the foundation of content becoming easier to make it more accessible for new players and solo enthusiasts. But the real reasons why things feel so easy now come down to pretty much 3 big changes that have happened over the years. The first thing we have to look at here is companions. The way they work has changed significantly over the game's lifespan. In the beginning, you had to gear your own companions and keep them just as up to date as you were. There were even specific missions that rewarded companion gear or weapons that players actually cared about. Does anybody remember when getting to Rishi during Shadow of Revan awarded you a high rating weapon for your companion? Stuff like that existed to help boost your chosen protege's combat power. However, gearing companions eventually shifted in favour of having their armour be purely cosmetic. Stats on your companions no longer mattered. The only way to make them stronger was to level up their influence skill. Max level companions would perform noticeably better than lower level ones. Actually, there is still one stat that affects your companion's performance, and it's called presence. You can slowly increase the presence stat by completing various legacy achievements tied to companions, which grants legacy-wide perks boosting that stat across all of your characters. Companion gear used to have presence baked into them, but with gear being purely cosmetic now, that's no longer the case. And here's another big change. You can now freely change your companion's role. They can be a healer, a DPS, or a tank for you. That was never possible in the old days. If you wanted a healing companion, you had to go out and recruit one who specifically healed. With all these changes, the solo player experience got a massive buff. You might think that removing gear stats would make companions weaker, but nope, that's not how it played out. Instead, companions became a weapon of mass AFK time. You can literally stand there and let your companion fight enemies for you, and more often than not, they'll win. Even against enemies that used to take multiple players to bring down, like heroic mission targets. Companions became so effective that heroic missions no longer needed groups. All you needed was a good companion set to healer and you were golden. This same trend carried into flashpoints. Players could easily solo the entire flashpoint as long as they brought along a decent companion, effectively removing the need to group up for multiplayer content that used to require coordination and teamwork. The next factor explaining the game's shift in difficulty is how powerful gear has become over time, without the introduction of a new endgame system to balance things out. So when you hit max level, you immediately start grinding for your top tier gear, but by the time you hit the level cap, you've usually already earned enough endgame currency to buy yourself a starter set of endgame gear. And even with that starter kit, often fully green, you can pretty much stomp through mobs and bosses if you know your class decently well. Once you upgrade that gear and get yourself a full set of purples or better, the gap widens even further. Things aren't just easier to kill, they often barely scratch you in return. An NPC might take ages to chip away at your health, even if you're standing still and doing absolutely nothing. And the moment you add a healing companion into the mix, you become a borderline immortal god, while this poor NPC keeps trying and failing to take you down. Now of course, this isn't true for every single encounter. There are certainly some bosses or tougher NPCs that will absolutely obliterate you if you just stand around AFK. But for the vast majority of the game, with all these changes, it's completely soloable. Flashpoints, heroics, class story bosses, uprisings even, you name it, all now feel ridiculously easy and pose little to zero challenge for any player who remotely knows what they are doing. Now the last big thing that's affected the game's difficulty curve is the level sync. This feature arrived with Knights of the Fallen Empire, which was, wow, about 10 years ago now. The level sync scales all player levels down to match the area that they are in. For example, a max level player on Korriban would be scaled down to about level 10 or something to fit the environment zone. At first glance, this seemed like a solid change, but it eventually turned out to be a pretty mixed bag. Here's why. One of the only reasons a max level player might even want to visit Korriban is for the sake of roleplay, and if two high level Sith Lords wanted to duel outside the academy, suddenly their health bars were squished down to those of a level 10ish character. This leads to anticlimactic duels that end far too quickly, undermining immersion. A max level Sith Lord wants to feel powerful wherever they go, not nerfed into oblivion. I could honestly go on about level sync all day, but this video is getting pretty long, so let's start to wrap it up. Ultimately, level sync made the game more annoying to play rather than truly increasing the challenge. It prevented players from completely resisting damage from lower level mobs and NPCs, and, well, that's pretty much it. So a max level character walking into a level 25 flashpoint couldn't just breeze through and laugh off incoming attacks purely due to a level difference. But when you combine this feature with everything else that we've talked about, the level sync's purpose basically becomes self-defeating. At the time of its release, it felt like a good idea to me personally, but looking back on it now, 10 years later, it's clear that the level sync feature wasn't fully thought through, or perhaps even finished. Sure, it helps prevent players from shrugging off damage, but it does nothing to account for player skill or the powerful impact of companions, which makes the whole effort feel mostly wasted, or at least that's how I see it. A lot of us thought that level sync would make the game feel more challenging, but all it really did was open the door to soloing content that people previously avoided because it was too boring. Maybe that was the developer's intention. Maybe not. But the question still stands, were these changes ultimately a good thing? I'm really eager to know what you guys think of that. Do you feel the game's gotten too easy these days? Do you wish some of those systems were refined even further? Let me know your thoughts and feedback down in the comments. I would have talked about operations, but I feel like their scale and difficulty over the years perhaps deserves its own video. So keep an eye out for that, and as always, may the force be with you.